Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome to Politicization of the Military, a part of the SAIS Merrill Center and Duke Program in American Grand Strategies Conference on Civil Military Relations, supported by the America in the World Consortium. Hello, I am James Horn. I am a dual degree candidate at Duke University for my MBA and my Master's of Public Policy, focusing in corporate finance and supply chain. So politicization of the military is not a new or recent phenomenon. However, in the past year and past months, past couple of years, we've increasingly seen this narrative kind of dominate our within the media and within conversations that we have within academia. So today, we are joined by three distinguished speakers. Jessica Blankshain, she's assistant professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. Ambassador Eric Edelman, he is a Roger Harkard distinguished practitioner in residence, Philip Merrill Jones Center, Johns Hopkins at SAIS. And we also have Dr. Jim Golby, a senior fellow of the Clements Center for National Security at University of Texas at Austin. So I will moderate a conversation with our speakers for about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to our virtual attendees for their questions. You may submit questions via Zoom in the Q&A function below. And please be sure to submit your name, title, and affiliation with your question. Please also indicate if you're a student, and because we're going to prioritize student questions throughout this engagement. Please keep in mind as well that all conference sessions, including the Q&A session, are going to be recorded. So let's go ahead and begin. Like as I said earlier, politicization of the military is going to be a huge issue that we're having to deal with, where you were speaking of, especially one of the things we're talking about throughout for this week. So I would like to start with our panelists, this kind of opening discussion as far as your thoughts, your background, and your thoughts on this topic. We'll start with Dr. Golby.
Hi, thanks so much, James, and thanks to Johns Hopkins, SAIS, the AWC, and all the other groups that have come together to host this fantastic and important discussion. As I look at politicization today, I'm actually quite concerned. I think that a number of trends are all moving in the wrong direction, and that it's happening not only within the military, but also among civilian political elites, among society more broadly. And if we don't have all of those groups with a shared understanding of the importance of civil military norms, with the importance of the values that are at stake, then I think we will find ourselves in an increasingly worse position over time. One of the things that my own research with Peter Fever and some recent research by Ron Krebs and Robert Ralston has found is that the support among the population for civil military norms is increasingly beginning to break along partisan lines. People are no longer judging actions or activities or beliefs or things that the military does based on whether or not those things are consistent with shared American values, but instead they're judging them based on whether or not those things benefit their partisan side. And when we find ourselves in a situation like that, it's very hard for us to both believe in the norms, to share the norms, and then to enforce those norms when they're broken. I think another thing that's been an interesting development over the last decade or so is the way that our focus has changed as scholars as we try to understand and grapple with this problem. As an active duty officer, I was always very focused on concerns about politicization by the military, what we might call sort of political activity or political activism. But over the last 10 years, in some ways, for all the problems that we've seen on the military side, we've actually seen some resilience. And in a very difficult time over the last year or year and a half, we actually saw many military officers comport themselves very well in very difficult situations, in situations that they could have made things far worse than they in fact were. On the other hand, though, we've seen a steady deterioration among civilian political elites and what I'll call this political activation, this idea that political leaders are now more and more trying to draw the military into partisan conflicts, whether it's drawing them into their campaign ads, whether it's using them as potted plants or spokesmen for particular policies, whether it's trying to court them as their own constituency or part of their partisan group. We're starting to see political leaders with really very little compunction actually reaching out to the military to form these mutually beneficial coalitions in some cases. And that's a dangerous place for us to be in, where not only do we have to worry about keeping the norms straight on the military side, but we also have to worry about increasingly how we're going to deal with a much harder problem to regulate on the civilian political elite side. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, James.
Thank you, Dr. Golby. Ambassador Edelman?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jim Golby and Jessica Blankshain, for being a part of this panel. I'm thrilled to be here with you guys, both of whom have really contributed so much to illuminating the broader issues of civil-military relations, including the issue of politicization. Let me start with a confession, and it's a confession of bad conscience. I was part of a group this year, National Security Leaders for Biden, that was guilty of doing, just what Jim Golby just talked about. We signed up a very large number of 3- and 4-star general officers to endorse Joe Biden. Now, I excuse myself and those of us who are involved in this activity on the grounds that, the Trump presidency was unprecedented and presented some particular challenges that maybe justified some extreme measures. But the truth is, this is, part of a pattern, as Jim was just saying, that goes back 30 years. And the culprits here are not the uniformed military as much, although they're willing participants in it, as much as the political class that I think really starting in the 1992 election, and now, quadrennially every 4 years, signs up, former flag officers to appear on the floor of the political conventions, to endorse presidential candidates. And I think that results over time have been like a pendulum swinging back and forth, worse and worse, kind of with each turn of administration. And so I've seen seriatim, folks in the Clinton administration regard the military leaders who they found when they came into office as Bush generals. I was part of the transition from Clinton to Bush, where a lot of the senior military leadership was seen by the incoming Bush 43 administration as Clinton generals. And the same was true when the Obama administration came in, with generals like Ray Odierno and Dave Petraeus being suspect as Bush generals. The truth is, we used to have political generals, in the 19th century. Didn't work out so well in the Civil War, and we professionalized our military and made it apolitical. It's true, I think it's a fact, that the profession of arms tends to attract people of a more conservative bent, but that's not the same thing as saying people of a particular partisan bent. And I think it's become very corrosive for the proper civil military balance to have this pattern continue. And I would hope that we can begin to stop it. I think it's been compounded, frankly, by the nominations of Jim Mattis and Lloyd Austin to be Secretary of Defense. And I don't say that with any malice towards either Secretary Austin or Secretary Mattis. Neither one of them sought the position. Both, I think, for good and sufficient reasons, accepted the president's offer. But there's a reason why the National Security Act of 1947 had first a 10-year and then it was amended to a 7-year ban on officers who have served within the last 10 or 7 years from becoming the Secretary of Defense, because Secretary of Defense by its nature is a political position. And the confusion that's created by appointing general officers, and now 2 in a row, which I think raises a question about whether the norm is being undone by the exceptions, are exacerbating this problem. And I hope we begin to get a handle on it, because I think the consequences down the road are potentially dangerous. I agree with Jim Golby that in the last year and a half, senior military leadership, under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, managed to preserve, the apolitical nature of the military, but it wasn't easy. And I don't know that we can continue in the direction we're going in indefinitely without really calling into question whether that can be preserved.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And finally, Professor Blankshain.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the invitation. Apologies for a little sun glare here. And I have to give my disclaimer that everything I'm about to say represents my own personal views, not those of my employer. I wanted to start by talking a bit about what we mean by politicization of the military and why we care about it, which I think will pick up on some themes that have already been mentioned by my co-panelists. One reason that we might care about politicization has to do with the health of the force, recruiting and retention, some of the things talked about in the previous panel. But another that's already been touched on a bit here has to do with the health of our democracy. As Jim alluded to, traditionally the civil-military relations concern, which is actually shared with concerns about other unelected parts of government, civil servants, for example, is ensuring that the military is responsive to political leadership, that there isn't a situation where the elected government has to worry about whether the military will only do what the government wants if the government is of a particular political party. The idea, right, is that the government is elected and is calling the shots, and it's up to the citizenry to hold that government accountable for what it does, including how it uses the military. But as Jim alluded to, I think recently there's been a shift where people often either implicitly or explicitly are almost expressing the opposite concern. By an apolitical military, they seem to mean that they want a military that will resist political control and not allow civilian politicians to use the military to accomplish political aims. And that's where things get really complicated. Because from that traditional democratic civil-military relations perspective, the idea that the military should be calling the shots or constraining elected policymakers is kind of alarming. But we also don't want a situation where the military is being used for advantage in partisan elections, as my co-panelists have noted, or even sort of as political shields in pursuit of policy. But that's different than saying that the military can't be used to pursue an administration's policy agenda, which is inherently political. And that's where I think there's some confusion over what we mean by political. As Jim and others have written about, politics is much broader than just partisanship and elections. I don't really think there is this mythical apolitical foreign policy agenda or national security strategy or military personnel policy that we should be pursuing. Politics is the way that we decide what the government should do, and it's up to the citizens, not the military, to hold the government accountable for those decisions. And so that's where I think this conversation around politicization of the military has gotten particularly complicated and alarming in recent months and years. And I'll leave it there.
No, I appreciate that, Professor Blankshain. And I definitely want to move back to that later on in our chat about the responsibility to push back and to stay apolitical, because I think that's a really deep and interesting thread to go in. But before we go into that, I kind of want to, very high level, how do you feel, and you can see it can be in recent terms, or we can say within the last 4 to 5 years, how do you feel like politicization of the military has impacted the efficacy of the Department of Defense? And Professor Blankshain, how about I start with you?
Sure, thanks. I think it's a good question. Here, one of my biggest concerns is that there is this idea that DOD as a whole is above politics, again, this idea, right, that even the Secretary of Defense is somehow apolitical and a military leader, when that's not the case. The Secretary of Defense is a political appointee who is there to carry out the administration's agenda. And I think that some of this political polarization has kind of increased that emphasis of we want this one last part of government that is safe, that is apolitical. And so a lot gets put on DOD that maybe shouldn't, because it's just so tempting to use that lever.
Ambassador Edelman?
I think, some of the issue here is, as Jessica said, there's a kind of confusion. So we talk, for instance, about having an apolitical military and having, civilian control of the military. In my experience, the issue is less per se about civilian control. I mean, the military leadership, in my experience, will obey civilian orders from the president, from the Secretary of Defense, et cetera. What's really gotten off kilter, I think, is the balance of advice that the president gets. And some of this goes back to Goldwater Nichols and the creation of a chairman who is the president's senior military advisor, required to give best military advice. Jim has written, about some of the dangers of what best military advice means. And so I'll leave it to him to talk about that. But because we've built up big military staffs, a very large joint staff, combatant command staffs, as part of the Goldwater Nichols era, we've also had an imbalance created because our political process has become so impacted by partisanship that getting civilian staff into the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947 to provide the element of civilian direction and control, has gotten harder and harder and harder. We routinely have 25 to 30% vacancies. It was higher in the Trump years. And if you look at the DOD right now, Lloyd Austin and Kath Hicks are pretty much home alone. There are not too many other presidentially appointed Senate confirmed folks, in the building. And that makes it very difficult to do what Jessica was just talking about, which is to have the civilians making decisions. Per force, military officers are being put into positions where they are giving policy advice, and at the senior levels, the line between military advice and political policy advice is totally permeable, and gets very fuzzy. And so the military is put into a position of having to go and execute things because they don't have civilian counterparts to deal with. By the way, this is not just, I want to be an equal opportunity abuser here. This is not just a function of executive branch dysfunction. The Congress plays a big role here, in part because of the difficulty of the confirmation process, but also because routinely the Congress will call up, for instance, combatant commanders and have them give a COCOM review of their area of operation and responsibility, and not insist that the appropriate civilian, whether it's the Undersecretary for Policy or the Assistant Secretary in OSD policy, be there at their side, testifying together. And so that, I think, has exacerbated this whole question of imbalance and shoved military officers into positions where they've got to behave as political actors by default.
Where do you see the solution in that then? In exacerbating or fixing or speeding up this process and to fill these positions in Mr. Ambassador?
Well, first, it would help if the administration would nominate people. They've been very slow on nominating people. Now, part of that, I think, is because of the delayed ascertainment by GSA of the election result, which held things up. And we had something similar in the 2001 transition when the disputed election held things up. And as a result, we had assistant secretaries of defense and undersecretaries being confirmed in June, July, and August. So it's important to get confirmed civilians in place so they can do their jobs and create the kind of healthy civil military relations that I think we need in the Department of Defense to serve the nation and serve the president. So that would be the first step, I would say.
Dr. Golby, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll come back to this question of efficacy a little bit as well. I think one of the real challenges here is that the more we draw military leaders into political positions, the more empowered they are to do that, and the more that the public expects them to take on those roles. I was on a panel this morning reading a great paper by Polina Beliakova, who was talking about a concept she called erosion by deference. And basically the idea is that there are lots of good reasons in the short term for politicians to use the military to sell a policy, to get support for a conflict, or to send the military out so that they can avoid blame, or to defer in a way that might give the military a little bit more power than you would usually expect to avoid a big civil military conflict. But the point she made was that these short-term trade-offs that people make have long-term consequences. And so Ambassador Edelman already talked about a few of them, but one is it changes the role of the military in the policy-making process. Part of this is because of this idea of best military advice, that it takes on almost this supernatural role, that when a military leader says something, a political leader who crosses them publicly will pay a cost. And I think that changes these internal dynamics. I absolutely agree that military leaders, will not disobey orders, but they have a pretty healthy influence on shaping the orders that they receive during the process that leads up in the orders process. And so I worry about those consequences. But increasingly, I'm also worried about other things that are happening sort of among the more junior ranks and in formations. With as much polarization as we have, as much politicization as there is, it starts to send messages to junior soldiers, to NCOs, to officers, that it's okay for the military to be involved in this way. It creates divisions where people, argue about politics and formations in ways that aren't healthy, that drive them apart. It creates those same problems, dividing people along values, and that hurts cohesion, it hurts effectiveness, it makes you trust people a little less than you probably need to. And it also sends messages to rising officers that there's benefit to being maybe a little less competent and a little bit more responsive to political leaders, sort of undermining some of the benefits that we really want leaders to have, where they can give sort of unvarnished advice that's, as helpful as it can be, but not totally colored by whether or not it's going to affect their next promotion or whether or not it's going to, improve their standing with political leaders. And I think the more we see this type of politicization, the more that those effects are going to come to the surface. And I think some of it's already happening. It just fortunately hasn't manifested in a massive crisis just yet.
Yeah, so, and Dr. Golby, this past winter, I think the siege on the U.S. Capitol, I think, kind of brought that to the forefront. And I think that's where we saw a lot more. I mean, in the previous panel, we talked on it a little bit, referenced some of the military participation, former military participation within that event. However, the media seemed to jump on it and portray it as a bigger issue, as a very large issue. I was wondering your thoughts. Do you feel like this divide is as big as they say? And are military service members as politicized as one might fear?
So I think that's a difficult question to answer, but what I would say is that political divisions in society absolutely lead to political divisions within the military. I am mostly of the mind that when you control for all the factors that you might with race and age and gender and everything else, that the overrepresentation of veterans probably wasn't quite as alarming as some of the initial reports made it seem. But the fact that we have any military leaders involved in assault on the Capitol is absolutely unacceptable. So even a small number is an alarming development. And, I think the hard thing is, how do you deal with that in a formation? Even if it's, 4 or 5% of people in a unit, if you're a commander and you're talking to your formation, how do you communicate in a way that respects 95% of your soldiers, but then puts the appropriate pressure or identifies those 5% who are the real problem? And I think even having those conversations, if leaders aren't prepared to do that, if they're not thoughtful about it, if they either bring their own political biases, or if they try to stay apolitical and not talk about it, we're left in a situation where those divisions just fester and get worse. And so I think we need to be doing more to prepare our leaders to deal with these situations and talk about them in an appropriate way, and sort of get them in the habit of not just shying away from these problems, because they're gonna stay there for a little while.
On mute there. Thank you, Dr. Golby. I wanted to open up, Professor Blankshain, did you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think Jim makes a really good point about this idea that the military is, to some extent, a reflection of society in these trends. This came up some in the previous panel, and there's sort of a normative question here of, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it might be a bad thing if we don't like that about society, but the alternative is moving more towards this sort of warrior caste idea that was mentioned some in the first panel, which I don't think we're there yet. But this idea of, well, actually, we don't want the military to be representative of society. We want them to have completely different political views, and interests can have its own bad consequences. And this is where I think we also need to draw a distinction between sort of having political views or even partisan views, right? Voting for one party or the other, privately supporting one candidate or the other, and acting on extremist ideologies. Those are very different things, and one of them bothers me in the military a lot more than the other does. I actually have one ongoing research project right now where we did a survey trying to understand how the public thinks about political activity by the military, by senior civil servants in the State Department, and actually by federal judges. So 3 different categories of federal employees who are theoretically apolitical in some sense, although possibly different senses. And what we found so far in our preliminary results is that the public is actually pretty okay with some of these private political behaviors by members of the military, voting, donating to candidates, things like that, in ways that I actually thought was somewhat surprising, given the military's reputation for being apolitical. But I do think it's important to distinguish between kind of different categories of political beliefs and political actions.
Thank you for that. And we have a lot of Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and move to that right now. And I'm going to start with Mark Lucido's question. And he's a Army warrant officer and a Duke student, current first-year Duke student. And he asks, as Ambassador Edelman discussed in his introduction, consecutive administrations have leveraged the military waiver to appoint former 4-star general officers to the position as SecDef. Does this send an affirming signal to the members of the armed forces that defense matters are, in fact, the extension of politics and is judged through partisan lenses? Does this send an affirming signal to the civilian population that political entities are being militarized? And I will start with Ambassador Edelman on that one.
Well, first, just one minor correction. We frequently, in the public discussion of this, there's discussion that there's a waiver. It's not a waiver. Actually, Congress has to pass a separate special piece of legislation to allow an exception to the law. There is no waiver authority. Clearly, that was meant to be a speed bump, to make it difficult for presidents to do this. We hadn't done it since George Marshall, before Jim Mattis in 2017. My own personal view, and I've argued this in print, is that we need to create more speed bumps and make it even more painful for a president to do this, because I do think it's extremely injurious. I mean, it's if you keep having exceptions to the norm, at what point is it no longer a norm? And I think we're getting close to that now. And I think the question, to some degree, answers itself. It is, I think, very dangerous to do this. And I think to get back to the question of efficacy, the reason why this is a problem is not that General Austin or General Mattis are bad people, or that the military folks are bad people. The problem is anybody who gets into one of these senior jobs, it'd be the same if I got into a senior job, if someone took leave of their senses and made me Secretary of Defense. What you do is turn to people whom you've worked with throughout your career. You use your Rolodex. And if you've spent 40 years in the United States Marine Corps, even if you've had a couple of joint assignments as a combatant commander, or if you spent 40 years in the United States Army, by and large, the people with whom you've worked and whom you have close relationships of trust are going to be the people in your service, or at least who share a military background with you. And so that immediately, for instance, I think is one of the things that bedeviled Jim Mattis when he was Secretary of Defense, and his front office, which was very heavily skewed towards Marine and Navy officers, retired, who were working in a civilian capacity now. And I think it hobbled the balance that I think you need between civilians and military in the management of the Pentagon. So I think we need to make this more difficult so it doesn't happen again in the future so easily.
Dr. Golby, did you have or any of our other panelists have thoughts on that question? If not, I have another one teed up.
I just have one
Sure.
quick thing. I mean, I agree with most of what's been said, but in terms of this, does it send an affirming signal to the members of the armed forces that defense matters are an extension of politics? I actually worry that it sends the opposite signal, that defense matters are somehow removed from politics. And so what we need in charge is a competent military expert who will do the military thing instead of the political thing. And that's what worries me, going back to this idea that the elected civilian government is supposed to be in charge. And if people don't like what they're doing, then they vote them out. So I worry more about that opposite message that it's sending, that sort of military expertise and competence is superior to civilian policymaking competence in ways. I mean, they're clearly both very important and have a role to play, but I worry about setting up that dynamic that the military should have the upper hand in policymaking.
James, if I could just add to what Jessica said, it builds on something Jim said. This goes back to this question of best military advice. Mm-hmm. It speaks to the issue that I raised earlier, which is at the most senior levels, when you're talking about the chairman or the service chiefs or the combatant commanders, when they are being asked for their best military advice, which is something they also have to promise the United States Senate before they get confirmed to these positions, that they're going to provide the Senate with their best military advice. That has generally been interpreted to mean, their advice, regardless of what the incumbent administration's position is on any given issue. But it sort of reifies the notion that there is such a thing as some pure, uncontaminated by politics military advice when you're talking about questions of peace and war, when there is no such thing. All of these things are inherently extremely political.
Right. Thank you.
I'll jump in real quick.
Go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I'll just jump in real quick if I can. Yeah. Because I think one thing that I want to highlight is we often talk about the internal dynamics in the Pentagon, which I agree with everything Ambassador Edelman and Dr. Blankshain have said. But I do think this question of what message does it send to the troops, to the public, to our allies and partners is underappreciated. And I think, Jess's work and some other scholars like Heidi Urban have looked at the way this is changing the way that soldiers and officers think about these norms. Some of my own work has showed the way that this is changing the way the public thinks about these norms. It's how you get the narrative of we need the adults in the room who are all retired military officers to check the elected civilian leader. And in any, one breaking of this norm, we certainly, can survive breaking one norm in a particular case. But the more that it changes the way that our society, our military, even our allies and partners think about these questions, the more negative effects are going to pile up over time. And so we do need to take sort of a broader societal view about this and make sure we're not just focused on the, the mechanics of advice in the Pentagon.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Golby. I'm going to now shift to a question from Bobby O'Keefe. He's a PhD student at American University and an Air Force colonel. He asks, how do you view politicization of the military as contributing to or interacting with the U.S. foreign policy trend towards militarization? And I will switch it right to you, Dr. Golby, if you'd like, or I can somebody else.
Happy to jump in.
Yeah.
So I think there's obviously some debate about exactly what we mean by militarization, whether we're using the military too much or too little, how we're using it. I think what is clear is that we are militarizing all aspects of public policy in ways that probably aren't helpful. The war on COVID. We need a 4-star general to solve the COVID crisis. Let's call out the military to fix our racial justice problem. I think, in those ways, I think it's clearly having impacts on our society and culture. In terms of, the militarization question, I diverge from some people's views on this. I actually think senior leaders' policy views are more divergent than many people point out. There certainly is a conservative bent to many senior military officers, but it matters a whole lot who the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the combatant commander is in terms of the advice that they give. And so I think, there are a lot of cross-cutting factors, but I wouldn't necessarily point, so-called militarization of foreign policy directly to the problem of politicization, though I do think that they're at least to some degree intertwined.
I guess I would say, in my experience, the senior military officers are not always, but frequently the ones most reluctant to use military force for as a solution to any given foreign policy problem. And it's really, I think, less a problem that having the military in these roles is militarizing our foreign policy than it is that if they're in the political roles, they sometimes may skew it the other way.
So I'm going to choose to define militarization for myself so that I can answer this, but sort of along the lines of this idea of going to the military as the first tool that's already been alluded to, because I agree with Jim that militarization doesn't really mean that there's sort of a military view on what to do necessarily, but more just this idea of, always go to the military first for foreign policy, but also as Jim noted, increasingly for some domestic issues. And I do think that politicization has contributed to that, perhaps in a somewhat counterintuitive way, in that because the military is seen as sort of above politics and the thing for everyone to support, that's one of the reasons that it's always easy to get funding for the military. Nobody wants to be seen as not supporting the troops. Obviously, there are other dynamics here too around basing and procurement and jobs and all of that members of Congress care about quite a bit. But there is this idea that that you have to support the troops and support the military, and that leads to this self-perpetuating situation where the military has the resources, so we call on the military to do things, and then we have a track record of the military succeeding in doing things because it has all the stuff that nobody else has, and so it kind of becomes the only tool that's available because we've underfunded everything else, because there isn't political consensus around supporting those other things.
So that actually teases up to our next question by Christopher Ankerson, a professor at NYU, on that very theme, Professor Blankshain. So I'm going to throw this to you immediately. And he asks, the idea that unprecedented times calls for extreme measures cannot be seen as an acceptable basis for healthy civil-military relations. Each party will always have ground to invoke the ends justify the means argument. So in a practical sense, how can we reset the civil-military relations and escape this cycle? Or do you feel that we have to reset our expectations?
This is a really hard question, and it's one that came up a lot in the discussions around the Austin nomination in particular, right? This idea of Is it good enough to say, well, they did it, so we should be allowed to do it too, or is that just as problematic? I don't know that there's an easy solution. I'm a scholar of civil military relations, so I'm very reluctant to say we should just give up the norms and reset, and that's what it is now. But I do think it's important to recognize that from a politicization point of view, we're already in an asymmetric situation. Where we have research showing that at this point, party ID is one of the best predictors of trust in the military, and that's driven by an increase in trust in the military among Republicans, where it hasn't increased as quickly among Democrats and independents. Also a trend of people being more confident in the military when the president is a co-partisan, that is more pronounced among Republicans. That's some work from David Burbach, my colleague at the Naval War College. Mike Robinson at West Point has also done some work finding that Republicans already view the military as sort of a co-partisan institution. So I do think it's important to recognize that we're in an asymmetric situation already. So kind of calling for symmetric solutions is probably not going to work.
Ambassador Edelman?
I agree with everything Jessica just said. I really don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, sorry. Dr. Golby.
Yeah, I would agree as well. The only thing I would note is that I think there is a difference in these discussions between the people who, like Ambassador Edelman, can recognize that they were making what they believed was a calculated choice based on the circumstances they faced, and recognizing the costs and coming back with a commitment to try to, undo some of the damage that they recognize they did for the greater good. In the sort of counter trend that we're seeing, which is a lot of people who just say, well, we did that and there weren't any problems, so why shouldn't we do this again? And I'm much more worried about the latter situation, where people just sort of throw up their arms and say, we did it in a crisis and now it's okay, than I am about the people who actually recognize, that there may be some really difficult situations that even if, a Civ Mil scholar isn't going to justify it, that people have to make those tough calls. It's when we start to give up on the fact that there are tough calls to deal with that it starts to be concerning.
Thank you. Our next question is from John McLaughlin. He's a distinguished practitioner in residence at SACE. And he asks, how fully does today's military leadership and the coming generation understand that their advice to the president should be non-political and professional? And is there a danger of leaning towards what they sense is political palatable or advantageous to careers? And does anybody want to tee up to that one first?
Well, let me start on that. I mean,
all right.
To John's question, and I think Jim, in his comments, has been adverting to this. I mean, one of the things that I find worrisome about the nominations of General Madison, General Austin, is that it begins to suggest to general officers that this might be a logical career path. I'm going to become a COCOM. I'm going to become director of the Joint Staff, or get this job or that job, and then become Secretary of Defense, and that might lead them to begin to tailor their advice to what they think is going to be most politically advantageous, for their career, and I do think that's something we really do need to watch out for. I don't know the answer to the question of how aware people are that this may be happening. Jim may be, better situated to answer that.
Thanks. So, I agree with the things Ambassador Edelman said, but I'll also note that I think that our military does a really poor job preparing senior leaders to engage in the process of giving military advice in a real world situation. Our doctrine is written so that, for the most part, the military planning process begins after political leaders have given you your end state, and it's just a matter of taking what they want you to do and going back and doing it. And the fact is having the the unique opportunity to watch this from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs side when I worked for General Dempsey, and then watching in the White House, that's not how it works. military and civilian leaders need to come together. They need to have difficult discussions to try to understand what problems it is they even want to deal with. And so there has to be an opening where military leaders need to understand that they have to understand the political context. They have to understand what political leaders want, but then they have to have the honesty and candor and courage to then say, when a political leader says, I want you to do this, and here's what I'm going to give you to do it, to say, I can't do that with what you have. And I think there's real pressure. We wouldn't talk about these things all the time if there weren't real pressure. I don't necessarily think it is, fundamentally corrupted our senior officer corps, but I also don't think we're doing a good job preparing leaders to do this. I think we err on the side of either you have to go in and throw your stars on the table and say, listen to what I say, God damn it, or on the flip side, you're stuck with a situation where you just go along to get along. And I think the reality is in between. It's involved in this dialogue of officers who understand the politics, but can bring their advice and expertise in a honest, truthful way that helps political leaders advance their goals.
We'll follow up with that, Jim. What level do you think it's appropriate to begin these conversations then?
I think we begin them too late. I have, over the last couple months, talked to a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a former combatant commander who said, I really didn't have anyone talk to me about this until I was a general officer. And that's crazy. The fact that someone can develop these habits throughout their military career and not sort of develop an understanding of how the military fits with the broader political process, when they're a 50-year-old man or woman, is just, we can't do that. So I think the earlier we do it, the better. We obviously do some of this in different capacities at our academies, but we need to look for other ways to do this as early as possible. It doesn't need to be the main focus, but at least familiarizing young officers with these ideas, I think, is helpful, even from initial entry training as they come into the service.
So as someone whose job it is to prepare senior military leaders for some of these positions, and again, speaking only in my personal capacity, it's really hard. It's something that I struggle with constantly in teaching at the command and staff and more college level of how do we make this clear, this distinction between understanding and operating in a political context while not crossing the line into sort of unhealthy political advocacy or some of these concerns about shading advice to be what policymakers want to hear. It's extremely difficult to do.
Jim, one additional follow-up, and this is from Paula Thornhill. Do you feel like this is a failure of professional military education? Should this be something that's more standardized, or something more lines of a mentorship as we begin grooming senior leaders?
I think that's a great question. The one thing I'll say is I know a lot of fantastic, faculty members in PME institutions, and almost to a T, every one of them recognizes the problem. But there are institutional barriers that keep them from doing it. So I want to make sure that we, keep the focus off those who are doing the hard work and doing the best they can. But I do think there are structural problems in terms of how much time do we give them? At what point in their career do officers have this? And more importantly, getting back to Paula's point, we need more of the types of things that people like Heidi Urban are doing. So I know Heidi has come up with basically a unit commander's guide for how do you talk about politics with your soldiers? Because if you're only hitting this in PME once every 5 years for 8 hours, which we're not doing 8 hours, I don't think in most cases, but even if you hit this every 5 years, it's not going to be enough. You need, just like on everything else, whether it's gunnery, whether it's the orders process, you need leaders who are going to invest in their soldiers, mentor them, and teach them what right looks like all the way through their career. And so I really applaud people like Heidi Urban who are going out and doing the hard work of figuring out how do we empower commanders to model this and talk to their other leaders and soldiers about this.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. It's from Christian Pontanoy. I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly. It's an undergraduate at Vanderbilt, and they ask, Can you speak more to the politicization of the National Guard, specifically regarding the deployments during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer compared to the late response during the Capitol insurrection?
I can take this one first.
Sure.
Some of the recent work I've been doing has been on the National Guard. And the National Guard is in an interesting situation in a number of ways when we talk about politicization. The first being that they have two bosses to some extent, right? They normally are under the control of the state and the governor, but they can be federalized and under the president's control, which complicates things. And also members of the Guard are part-time, which is not a knock on anyone's professionalization or skills or anything like that. But the idea is that these are people who have normal civilian lives theoretically and serve part-time. And that introduces all sorts of things, like the fact that it is perfectly allowable for members of the National Guard and the reserves to serve in Congress for a political party while they are a member of the National Guard or Reserve, which is not something that we allow active duty members to do. But I think as we've used the National Guard more and more for a number of things, first overseas operations starting in the 90s and then accelerating after 9/11, and as the question notes, I mean, we've traditionally used them domestically for a number of things, including things like hurricane responses, but more recently in response to some of these protests. The distinction, that sort of part-time distinction, is fading, and they are in this role more and more of the time. And I think it's possible that the public has a harder time distinguishing. That said, some research that I just presented at another conference yesterday that I'm working on with Lindsay Kahn and Danielle Lepton is trying to understand how the public views the National Guard's role in these responses. And so far, we're actually finding that they, at least in terms of domestic intervention, do seem to distinguish between the National Guard and the military. They don't just view those as the same thing. They're more comfortable with National Guard interventions domestically than they are with active duty interventions in domestic situations.
Let me just add that you know, the two, there's probably some relationship between the two events that the questioner raises. So let me make a couple of points here, because it's really a complicated issue, as Jessica suggested. First, Jim made the point correctly that we face not just the politicization of the military, but the militarization of everything, and that's in part because as government has become less capable of getting things done in our country and more subject to partisan paralysis because of hyperpolarization, the military is the one institution that people think can get things done. And it's one of the reasons why we turn to them, as Jessica was just saying, for things like hurricane response. But there are also, norms and laws that govern this. We're not supposed to use the military in this country for law enforcement. That's why we have the, Insurrection Act and the Posse Comitatus Act to try and put limits on that. I think it's a mark of how toxic the Trump administration was for all of this, for this whole set of issues, that when the president tried to use the Black Lives Matter protests after the death of George Floyd as a opportunity to do a political commercial, he also dragged the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff into his photo op, which both of them, upon reflection, and I think both of them in good faith, didn't quite realize what they were getting into when that event started, both realized was injurious to precisely the subjects we've been touching on in this panel discussion. And both sought to make amends, as it were, by making public statements, making it clear that we should not use the military for law enforcement purposes in the United States. They were reinforced by a group of about 85 of us former senior defense officials who sent an open letter to the Washington Post making the same point. It's worth noting that that's one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that ended up getting Secretary Esper fired by President Trump right after the election. And I'm not sure that the president wouldn't have tried to fire Mark Milley if he could have as a result as well. I think, to put the most charitable interpretation on it, Acting Secretary Miller's slow response on January 6th, at least according to what he says in the Vanity Fair article that he was interviewed for, which was an effort clearly at reputation rehabilitation on his part, argues that in part it was because of the events in June that he was maybe a little slow to immediately authorize and respond to what happened on January 6th with the use of the Guard. I'm willing to concede that that may have been a part of the calculation, but I think there were probably other things at play as well.
Well, thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone, for participating. I know we're getting really short on time. So, biggest thing is, with every problem, you should always think, like, hey, where do we go from here? What's the next step, and how should we address this, either as leaders, as academics, and as just regular citizens? So I was wondering if the panelists, as we leave for today, either what steps do you think the DoD can take to address this problem, like head on, either the Department of Defense from the military standpoint, or from the civilian leadership? And I'll start with Professor Blankshain.
So I think the last part of what you said there is key, that to address this, and this is echoing some things that Jim said in his opening remarks, the military side can't address this alone. This is not a military problem to fix. It's a problem that really is on civilian leadership, both elected and political appointees, and on citizens more broadly, to stop trying to use the military in this way. Now there's a chance that the military will just become so politicized that it's not tempting to use it in this way anymore, because it's not the sort of above politics shiny object that can be used as a shield. But I personally would not like that to be the reason that we stop using it that way, because it's not useful anymore. So I would say that I think more emphasis has to be put on the civilian side. Alice Hunt-Friend has been doing some really interesting work here on how do we address civil-military relations from the civilian policymaker side, not just talking about kind of what does the military need to understand about this.
Professor Edelman?
I pretty much agree with what Jessica said. I think the civilians, and by that I mean the civilians in the Department of Defense, the civilians who are parts of the other parts of the executive branch, particularly in the White House, and the civilians who make up the membership of the United States Congress need to all do their jobs. I co-chaired with Admiral Gary Roughead a commission that reviewed the National Defense Strategy, and one of the things we addressed was this imbalance in civil military advice. And we were under some pressure from congressional staff at the time to recommend that they provide new legal authorities to the civilians to sort of counteract this imbalance. And our view unanimously on the commission was, you didn't need any new legal authorities. You just needed the civilians in the jobs that they're in now to use their damn authorities.
And Dr. Golby.
Yes, a lot of great points. I'm going to hit a topic that we haven't hit as much, just because I think it's worth emphasizing. We don't want the military not to be trusted. We don't want an institution that is ineffective or that people can't count on. And so while there may be some benefit in seeing, sort of confidence in the military level out and not be quite as inflated as it has been, what I'd really like to see leaders do is start, not bashing other forms of government service, not talking down the civil service, not talking about the deep state, not making, the bureaucracy or political leaders the enemy of our country, not just taking these cheap shots to make everyone in our society think that government doesn't work. Because I think a lot of things really do work. And I think we need to have some of that balance. And a big part of that balance is by lifting up and building up and investing in the civilian side of civil military relations. And, I could go into a lot of specifics on how to do this, but I think, more than any regulation, more than any legal change, as Ambassador Edelman pointed to, this is going to come down to a question of whether or not people actually believe these values and whether or not they're going to commit and invest in having a balanced civil military relationship where civilians are empowered to do their jobs and where we value the civilian contribution to this conversation.
Dr. Golby, thank you for that last bit. I think that's probably one of the more insightful points, even though super simple, but it was great. And I want to thank all three of our panelists today and the speakers for attending. We really appreciate your insight, really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you sharing your evening with us. This has been a great discussion.